September 29th, 1975. Latin Casino, Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Jackie Wilson was halfway through Lonely Teardrops when his body stopped obeying him. The spin that usually brought crowds to their feet, the split that made women scream, the soaring note that defied physics, all of it was there in his muscle memory. But his heart, his exhausted, overworked 41-year-old heart, had finally had enough. He collapsed on stage, face first. The microphone hit the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the suddenly silent room. The band stopped playing. The audience thought it was part of the show. Some people actually started to applaud, waiting for Jackie to spring back up with that million-dollar smile, because Jackie Wilson always got back up, but not this time. By the time paramedics reached him, his brain had been without oxygen for nearly 4 minutes. Jackie Wilson's eyes would open again. But Jackie Wilson, the man who could make an audience forget their troubles with a single note, was already gone. He would spend the next 8 years in a nursing home bed, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to sing, alive, but not living. 13 years earlier, February 27, 1968. A small apartment on West 165th Street, Harlem. Frankie Lymon was found on his grandmother's bathroom floor, 25 years old, a syringe near his arm. The boy who'd made teenage girls scream at 13, who'd hit notes that shouldn't have been possible, who'd been called the future of rock and roll, died alone. And nobody noticed for hours. 2 of the greatest voices ever given to human beings, both destroyed before they turned 50. This is what happens when the music industry treats talent as product, and bodies as machines that can be run until they break. But the question nobody asked until it was too late was simple. How do 2 people with gifts that rare, that precious, that irreplaceable end up used, discarded, and destroyed? The answer is even simpler. When you're treated like a commodity instead of a human being, it doesn't matter how talented you are. The system consumes you anyway. But here's what the industry never tells you. They died differently. But they were destroyed by the same thing. Jackie Wilson was born Jack Leroy Wilson, Jr. in Detroit, Michigan, in 1934. Frankie Lymon was born Franklin Joseph Lymon in Harlem, New York, in 1942. 8 years apart. Different cities, different childhoods, but the same impossible gift. Voices that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human limitation. Jackie's mother heard him singing in church when he was 9, and she actually cried. Not because it was cute, because it was perfect. Adult power in a child's body. Frankie's mother heard him harmonizing with his brothers when he was 6, and she knew immediately. This one was different. This one had something that couldn't be taught. By the time Jackie was 16, he was already performing professionally. By the time Frankie was 12, he was sneaking out to sing on Harlem street corners with older kids who couldn't believe what they were hearing. Both of them learned early that their voices could do something magical. They could make adults stop talking, make rooms go silent, make strangers cry without knowing why. But talent like that doesn't stay hidden. And once the industry finds it, it doesn't let go. Frankie Lymon and the teenagers walked into a recording studio to cut a demo. Frankie was 13 years old. The song was called Why Do Fools Fall in Love? And the producer, looking at this tiny kid standing in front of a microphone that had to be lowered to its absolute minimum height, had reservations. Serious reservations. You really think a kid can carry this? The producer asked the group's manager. Just let him sing, the manager said. Frankie opened his mouth, and the room changed. The engineer in the booth actually stood up from his chair. The producer forgot what he'd been about to say. That voice, crystalline, powerful, emotional in ways that shouldn't have been possible from someone who hadn't even hit puberty yet, filled the studio like something otherworldly. When the song ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the producer said quietly, "We're putting this out tomorrow." Why Do Fools Fall in Love hit number 6 on the Billboard Pop Chart, number 1 on the R&B chart. Frankie Lymon, 13 years old, became a star overnight. Teenage girls screamed his name. Ed Sullivan wanted him on the show. Dick Clark made him a regular on American Bandstand. Adults lined up to sign contracts, make promises, take meetings, and Frankie, barely a teenager, signed everything they put in front of him. Because when you're 13, you trust that adults know what they're doing. But here's what nobody told Frankie. Those contracts weren't designed to protect him. They were designed to extract every dollar possible before his voice changed, before puberty hit, before he stopped being profitable. Jackie Wilson replaced Clyde McPhatter in a group called the Dominoes. He was 23, and from his very first performance, people knew they were watching something they'd never seen before. Jackie didn't just sing. He moved, he spun, dropped into splits, slid across stages, hit notes while doing backflips that should have been impossible while standing still. His voice had a range that music critics struggled to describe. 4 octaves, operatic power, gospel soul. He could whisper and break your heart, then belt and shake the walls. They started calling him Mr. Excitement, and it fit. Because watching Jackie Wilson perform wasn't just entertainment. It was an experience that left audiences physically exhausted just from watching. But here's what nobody told Jackie. That level of performance, that physical intensity, that constant pushing of his body to its absolute limit night after night after night, it had a cost. And the industry didn't care about that cost as long as tickets kept selling. By 1958, both men were at the top. Frankie had multiple hits. Jackie had gone solo and released Lonely Teardrops, a song that would become his signature. Both were touring constantly. Both were making other people very, very rich. Both were being pushed harder than human bodies are designed to be pushed, and both were starting to crack under the pressure in ways nobody wanted to acknowledge. For Frankie, the cracks were internal, psychological, identity-based. He'd been famous since he was 13. He'd never had a childhood, never had privacy, never had the chance to figure out who Frankie Lymon was when he wasn't performing. By the time he was 16, he was already exhausted, burned out in ways that 16-year-olds shouldn't even understand. And then his voice started changing. Puberty, the thing every teenage boy goes through, became a career death sentence. Because the industry hadn't signed Frankie Lymon the person. They'd signed Frankie Lymon the high voice. And when that voice dropped, they stopped caring. Record executives who'd called him the future of music stopped returning phone calls. Producers who'd fought to work with him suddenly had scheduling conflicts. By 17, Frankie Lymon, who'd been on top of the world at 13, couldn't get a record deal. The confusion, the rejection, the sudden realization that nobody wanted him anymore, it broke something inside him. He started using heroin. Not because he was looking for a high, because he was looking for an escape from the realization that he'd been used and discarded before he was old enough to vote. For Jackie, the cracks were physical, medical, literal. His heart was giving warning signs as early as 1960. Doctors told him to slow down, to stop with the acrobatic performances, to take breaks, to treat his body like it was human instead of treating it like an indestructible stage prop. Jackie ignored them, because slowing down meant smaller crowds. Smaller crowds meant less money. Less money meant the industry moved on to the next act. So he kept performing, kept spinning, kept dropping into splits that made his joints scream, kept hitting those impossible high notes while his cardiovascular system begged him to stop. 1963. Frankie Lymon stood outside a recording studio in New York, waiting for a meeting that would never happen. He was 20. His voice had settled into a decent adult range. He'd written new songs, prepared new material, convinced himself that if he could just get one more chance, he could prove he was more than the kid who sang Why Do Fools Fall in Love? The receptionist kept telling him the producer was running late. After 2 hours, she finally admitted the truth. There is no meeting. He doesn't want to see you. I'm sorry. Frankie stood there, absorbing this information. Then he walked out. And later that night, in an apartment that smelled like old cigarettes and broken dreams, he injected heroin into his arm for the 3rd time that week. The brutal thing about addiction isn't the high, it's the clarity. The moments between doses when you understand exactly what you're doing to yourself and you do it anyway, because the alternative, facing the reality that the world threw you away after using you up, is somehow worse. 1968. Jackie Wilson was performing 6 nights a week, sometimes 7. His heart was struggling. He could feel it between songs, the irregular beats, the shortness of breath that wasn't just from exertion, the chest pains he told himself were muscle strain. His doctor had been explicit. Jackie, you need to stop, at least slow down. Your heart can't sustain this. I'm fine, Jackie had said, smiling that smile that convinced audiences everything was perfect even when it wasn't. I've never felt better. It wasn't true. Jackie knew it wasn't true. But stopping meant admitting his body had limits. And Jackie Wilson had built his entire career on defying limits. What nobody understood about either of them was this: they weren't just performers. They were products. And products have shelf lives. Frankie's shelf life was determined by puberty. Jackie's was determined by how long his body could withstand being treated like a machine. And when those shelf lives expired, the industry didn't provide soft landings or retirement plans or support systems. It just moved on to the next product. February 1968. Frankie Lymon's grandmother found him on her bathroom floor. The syringe told the story nobody wanted to acknowledge, that the 13-year-old boy who'd made America fall in love with his voice had spent his entire adult life trying to understand why America stopped loving him back. The autopsy listed the cause of death as acute heroin intoxication. But the real cause was simpler. He'd been used until there was nothing left to use, and then he'd been forgotten while he was still alive. The funeral was small. A few family members, some former teenagers, a handful of people from the neighborhood who remembered when Frankie Lymon was the most famous kid in Harlem. The music industry, the people who'd made millions off his voice, sent flowers. Not people, just flowers. As if that somehow balanced the scales. As if roses could make up for royalties he never saw, contracts designed to exploit a child, and a system that treated him as disposable the moment his voice changed. But Jackie Wilson's destruction was slower, more visible, more cruel in its prolongation. September 29, 1975. Jackie Wilson, 41 years old, collapsed on stage in the middle of Lonely Teardrops. Heart attack, massive, catastrophic. By the time paramedics got him to a hospital, the oxygen deprivation had caused severe brain damage. He survived, but survival isn't the same as living. Jackie Wilson spent the next 8 years in a nursing home, unable to speak, unable to walk, unable to recognize his own children when they visited. The man who'd moved across stages like gravity didn't apply to him couldn't move at all. The voice that had 4 octaves and operatic power couldn't form words. And here's the part that destroys you when you really think about it. Those 8 years. Jackie was alive. Technically alive. His eyes would open. His body would breathe. But Jackie Wilson, the artist, the performer, the man who could make audiences forget their troubles with a single note, he died on that stage in Cherry Hill. What remained was just biology. A body that kept functioning after the person inside it was already gone. The nursing home bills were astronomical, and the industry that had made millions off Jackie Wilson's broken body over decades of performances, they contributed nothing. Dick Clark, who'd featured Jackie on American Bandstand dozens of times, organized a benefit concert. That raised some money, but it wasn't enough. Never enough. Jackie Wilson, who'd filled arenas, who'd sold millions of records, who'd performed until his body literally gave out on stage, spent his final years in a facility paid for by charity. He died on January 21st, 1984, 49 years old. Pneumonia, the death certificate said. But really, he'd died 9 years earlier on that stage. His body just took a long time to realize it. Two voices, different destructions. But when you step back and look at the pattern, when you see what actually happened instead of the sanitized industry narrative, it's the same story told two different ways. Frankie burned out from the inside, Jackie burned out from the outside. But both of them were fuel, consumed completely. Used until there was nothing left, then discarded when the burning was done. Years later, music historians would talk about both of them in respectful tones. Pioneers, they'd say, legends, influential. And all of that was true. Frankie Lymon influenced everyone from Michael Jackson to Smokey Robinson. Jackie Wilson influenced everyone from Elvis to Prince. Their vocal techniques are still studied, their performances still referenced. But here's what those respectful historical analyses always leave out. They were children and young men who were treated like products by an industry that measured their worth in quarterly profits instead of human dignity. Michael Jackson, who studied both of them obsessively, understood this better than most. He talked about it in interviews late in his life. How he'd watched footage of Frankie Lymon performing at 13 and 14, seen that mix of joy and exhaustion in his eyes, recognized it because he'd lived it himself. How he'd studied Jackie Wilson's stage techniques, but also recognized the cost, the physical toll, the way performing at that level breaks you down molecule by molecule. Michael understood because he'd lived the same pattern. Child star, incredible talent, industry exploitation, physical and psychological damage that never fully healed. The main difference was that Michael had Joe Jackson, controlling and abusive as he was, at least thinking about long-term career strategy. Frankie had Morris Levy, a mob-connected record executive who cared about quarterly returns. Jackie had managers who cared about booking as many shows as physically possible. In 1988, Frankie Lymon's Why Do Fools Fall in Love was featured prominently in the ceremony when the teenagers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Frankie had been dead for 20 years. The industry that had exploited him, discarded him, and forgotten him was now celebrating his legacy. The irony was almost too perfect, almost too cruel. They built museums to honor the artists they destroyed, as if recognition after death somehow made up for exploitation during life. In 1987, Jackie Wilson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He'd been in a nursing home bed, non-responsive, for 12 years. He would die 3 years after his induction, never knowing he'd been honored, never able to attend, never able to speak or sing or perform, or do any of the things that had defined his existence before that stage collapse stole everything from him. The plaques went up, the exhibits were curated, the historical record was written. But what nobody wants to acknowledge is this. The same industry that now celebrates their contributions is the same industry that treated them as disposable. That pushed Frankie until he broke psychologically. That pushed Jackie until his body literally gave out on stage. That made millions off their talent and paid them as little as possible. That designed contracts to exploit rather than protect. That cared about profit margins more than human beings. There's a lesson in these two lives, these two destructions, these two ends, and the lesson isn't complicated. Talent without protection is just exploitation with better press. A gift without boundaries is just an invitation to be used, and an industry that treats human beings as products will always consume them completely and then move on to the next source of profit without looking back. Frankie Lymon was 13 when he became famous, 25 when he died, 12 years. That's how long his career lasted, how long the industry found him useful. Jackie Wilson performed professionally for nearly 30 years, and it killed him, literally killed him, burned him out so completely that his body collapsed on stage and his brain never recovered. Different timelines, different methods, same result. Both were used until there was nothing left to use, and then they were forgotten while they were still breathing. If there's anything redemptive in these stories, it's this. Their voices still exist. Recordings don't decay the way bodies do. You can still hear 13-year-old Frankie Lymon hitting notes that seem impossible, joy and talent and youth all mixed together in a performance that reminds you why people fell in love with him in the first place. You can still hear Jackie Wilson's four-octave range, still feel the power and emotion he poured into every single note, still understand why people called him Mr. Excitement. The recordings survived, even if the men who made them didn't. But maybe that's the saddest part, that their voices outlived them, that the product survived while the human beings were destroyed, that we can still consume their talent, still enjoy their performances, still celebrate their contributions without ever having to confront the system that killed them. Two voices God gave once in a generation. Both destroyed before 30, not by accident, not by bad luck, by an industry that measured their worth in dollars and decided consciously or unconsciously that consuming them completely was an acceptable cost of doing business. That's not tragedy. That's not fate. That's a choice. A system built on exploitation that we all participated in every time we bought a record, attended a concert, or celebrated their talent without asking what it cost them to give it to us. Frankie Lymon and Jackie Wilson. Remember the voices, but also remember what those voices cost. And maybe, just maybe, that memory might change how we think about the next gifted child, the next incredible performer, the next once-in-a-generation talent who shows up asking for a chance to share their gift with the world. Maybe we'll remember that gifts like that deserve protection, not exploitation, care, not consumption, human dignity, not quarterly profit margins, because if we don't learn that lesson, we'll keep destroying the very talent we claim to celebrate. And 50 years from now, someone will make another documentary about another destroyed genius and wonder how this keeps happening. As if the answer isn't right in front of us. As if we don't already know exactly what we're doing. As if consumption disguised as celebration wasn't the same pattern we've been repeating since the industry began.